She was a woman who had given her entire life to the service of her country. From a very young age, she dreamed of wearing the uniform, standing tall and proving that strength and courage were not limited to men alone. Growing up, she often heard people tell her that the military was no place for a woman, especially not for a black woman. But instead of letting those words weaken her, she turned them into fuel. She studied harder, trained longer, and pushed herself beyond limits. Every challenge she faced became another reason to rise higher, and with time she built a reputation that no one could ignore. Her journey was not easy. At the academy, she was often underestimated. Some thought she would give up after the first few weeks of training. Others whispered that she was too fragile, too soft, or too emotional to survive in such a harsh environment. But she proved them all wrong. Day after day, she showed strength, discipline, and determination. When her fellow cadets struggled to complete long runs or carry heavy gear, she was right there at the front, never asking for pity or shortcuts. She believed that if she wanted to lead one day, she had to prove she was worthy of respect in every way. Years passed, and with every promotion, she broke barriers that many believed were unbreakable. She became one of the few women to rise through the military ranks with such speed and excellence. Each medal on her uniform carried a story of sacrifice, bravery, and leadership. She had served in dangerous missions overseas, standing beside her soldiers in moments of fear and chaos. She had guided her teams through situations that tested not only their strength, but also their humanity. Her decisions saved lives, her wisdom inspired young officers, and her fairness earned her loyalty from those under her command. Despite all her achievements, she remained humble. She never walked into a room expecting respect because of her title. Instead, she earned it through kindness and the way she treated people. She listened when her soldiers spoke. Whether they were generals or the newest recruits, she believed every voice mattered, and that belief made her stand out even more. Her troops knew she was not just a leader who gave orders, but one who cared for their well-being. She remembered birthdays, sent letters to families of deployed soldiers, and stood by grieving families when tragedy struck. Beyond the uniform, she was also a daughter, a sister, and a mentor. She often visited schools to speak to young girls who dreamed of careers in fields where women were rarely seen. She told them her story not to boast, but to remind them that limits only exist if you accept them. She encouraged them to believe in themselves, to fight for their dreams, and to never let prejudice define their future. Her speeches lit a fire in the hearts of many, especially those who felt the world doubted them because of their background or gender. What made her story even more inspiring was her calm and steady nature. She had faced situations where life and death were separated by a single decision, yet she never panicked. She stayed strong, analyzed the situation, and led her people to safety. That level of courage came not from arrogance, but from a deep sense of responsibility. She knew that as a leader, others looked to her for guidance, and she could never let fear cloud her judgment. Her name became known not only in the Pentagon but also among communities across the country. People admired her not only because of the stars on her shoulders, but also because of her character. For young black women, she became a symbol of hope and proof that it was possible to rise in spaces where they were told they didn't belong. For the military, she was a reminder that greatness came in many forms. And for her nation, she was a hero whose story deserved to be told. What truly set her apart, however, was her balance of toughness and compassion. She could command an army with firmness, yet she could comfort a soldier in tears with gentleness. She could sit in a high-level strategy meeting discussing national security, and later that day, kneel down to comfort a child in a war zone. She embodied the idea that true strength comes not from intimidation, but from empathy and integrity. Over time, she reached the rank of general, a position very few women had ever achieved, and even fewer women of color. This made her not only a trailblazer but also a constant target of scrutiny. Every step she took was watched closely, but she never faltered. She carried herself with dignity, never allowing negativity to shake her focus. She believed that her duty was bigger than her, bigger than the challenges, and even bigger than the prejudices she faced. Her career was a living example of perseverance. From the small town where she was born to the grand halls of the Pentagon, her journey inspired countless people. And while she had many reasons to be proud, she never forgot the struggles she faced along the way. She used those struggles as lessons to guide others, reminding them that resilience was the key to success. By the time this story begins, She was not just a general in uniform, she was a symbol of progress, justice, and hope. She represented what it meant to serve with honor, to lead with courage, and to never surrender to the weight of prejudice. Little did anyone know that even with all her accomplishments, she was about to face one of the most humiliating and unjust moments of her life, not on a battlefield, but on the streets of her own country. It was a calm evening when the general decided to take a short drive after finishing a long day of work. She wasn't wearing her uniform that day. Instead, she had chosen simple casual clothes, jeans, a plain shirt, and a light jacket. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary woman heading home after a tiring day. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that screamed authority or power. And yet, behind that simple appearance was a leader who had commanded thousands of troops, advised the Pentagon on national security, and made decisions that changed the course of missions overseas. She drove quietly, the radio playing soft music, her thoughts still lingering on the busy meetings she had attended earlier. She was used to stress, but the car gave her a small space of peace. The city lights were glowing, traffic was smooth, and everything seemed normal. But sometimes life changes in a single moment, without warning. As she drove through a neighborhood that she didn't usually pass by, she noticed the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was following closely, signaling her to pull over. She slowed down and parked on the side of the road, wondering what the problem could be. She hadn't been speeding. Her car was in perfect condition, and she knew she hadn't broken any rules. At first, she thought it must be some misunderstanding that would be cleared up quickly. After all, she respected the law deeply. She had dedicated her life to protecting it. But the look on the faces of the two officers as they approached her window told a different story. Their expressions were not calm or professional. Instead, their eyes were sharp, suspicious, and filled with something that made her uneasy. She greeted them politely, speaking with the same respect she expected from others. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. Instead of answering her question, one officer immediately asked, "Whose car is this?" His tone was harsh, almost accusing. "It's mine," she replied, showing no sign of irritation. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" The second officer leaned closer, shining a flashlight directly into her face as if she were already guilty of something. "Step out of the car," he ordered coldly. The general hesitated. There was no explanation, no reason given, and yet she felt the situation turning darker by the second. She had dealt with dangerous situations before, even in combat zones. But there was something deeply unsettling about being treated this way in her own country. Still, with her years of discipline, she kept her composure. "May I know why I'm being asked to step out?" she asked. The officer smirked. "Don't make this harder for yourself. Just do as you're told." Her heart sank, not out of fear for herself, but out of disbelief. Here she was, a decorated general of the United States military, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than prejudice. She wasn't wearing her stars, her medals, or her uniform that proved who she was. To them, she was just another black woman sitting in a car at night, and they had already decided what kind of person she must be. Slowly, she stepped out, raising her hands to show she had nothing to hide. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but the coldness in the officers' voices was far sharper. People passing by began to slow their cars, some even glancing curiously at the scene unfolding on the roadside. The officers didn't care about her calmness or her dignity. One of them pushed her against the car roughly, searching her pockets as if she were a suspect in a serious crime. "Do you have any weapons? Any drugs?" he demanded. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady. "No. I am a general in the United States Army. I suggest you check my ID before making assumptions." But they laughed, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president," one officer mocked. To them, her words were nothing more than lies. They had already judged her without evidence, without reason. At that moment, the humiliation struck her deeply. She had spent her entire life fighting for the safety of her country, for the same flag these officers wore on their uniforms. She had stood on battlefields, risking her life for freedom and justice. Yet, here on a quiet city street, she was stripped of her dignity in front of strangers who refused to see her as anything more than the color of her skin. Still, she did not break. Her training had taught her never to show weakness in the face of injustice. She stood tall even as they cuffed her wrists and tightened the metal until it dug painfully into her skin. Every movement they made was filled with prejudice, every word with disrespect. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a distance. Some whispered, some recorded the incident on their phones, shocked that such treatment was happening in plain sight. But the officers remained unmoved, convinced they had the power and she was powerless. Inside, however, the general knew something they did not. She was not powerless. She carried with her not only the authority of her rank, but also the respect of the Pentagon and the entire military structure. She knew that with one call, she could change the entire situation. But for the moment, she allowed herself to endure the humiliation, silently preparing for the moment when truth would shatter their false power. For now, she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the ugly grip of prejudice. But soon the officers would learn who she truly was, and the consequences of their arrogance would echo far beyond this roadside stop. The handcuffs were tight around her wrists, digging into her skin with every small movement. The cold metal felt like an insult, not just to her as a person, but to everything she represented. She stood there on the side of the road, her breath steady but her mind racing, as the two officers treated her not with the respect that any citizen deserved, but with the contempt reserved for criminals. And in their eyes, she wasn't a decorated general, a war hero, or a leader. To them, she was just another black woman they had decided to mistrust. The flashlight beam swept across her face again and again, as though they were searching for signs of guilt written in her features. "What are you doing here?" one officer demanded, his tone sharp, laced with suspicion. "I was driving home," she replied calmly. Her voice carried the weight of discipline even now. Years of military training had taught her not to let emotion cloud her words. But they didn't hear her. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. To them, her calm answers sounded like arrogance. To them, her steady posture looked like defiance. And when she dared to look directly into their eyes instead of bowing her head, they took it as a challenge. "Don't look at me like that," the taller officer snapped. "You think you're better than us?" She wanted to laugh at the irony, but she held it in. Better, no, but stronger? Absolutely. She had led soldiers through gunfire, negotiated with foreign leaders, and carried the weight of her country's safety on her shoulders. And here she was, being reduced to nothing by two men blinded by prejudice. The second officer circled her slowly, as though he were a predator studying prey. "What's in the trunk?" he asked. "Clothes, some files, nothing more," she answered. "Open it," he ordered. Her patience was wearing thin. She had already explained herself. She had already cooperated. But prejudice does not listen to reason. Prejudice only looks for ways to justify its own cruelty. When she hesitated, not because she refused, but because the handcuffs restricted her movements, one of them shoved her forward roughly. "Don't play games with us." Her jaw tightened. She wanted to remind them that respect is the first rule of true authority, that power abused is power lost. But she held her tongue. She knew these men were not looking for truth. They were looking for control. And the easiest way for them to feel powerful was to humiliate someone they believed could not fight back. The crowd on the other side of the street was growing larger now. Some whispered to each other. Others held up their phones, recording everything. She wondered how the videos would look later. A woman in handcuffs being shoved and shouted at, treated like nothing. None of the cameras would capture the truth of who she was. They would not show the medals, the stars, the battlefield scars, or the sacrifices she had made. They would only show a black woman in cuffs, surrounded by men who thought they had the right to strip her of her dignity. "License and registration," the shorter officer barked. "It's in my purse." "On the passenger seat," she said evenly. The officer retrieved the purse and dumped its contents onto the hood of her car without care. Lipstick, a small notebook, her phone, her military ID, and finally, her driver's license scattered across the surface. The officer's eyes landed on the ID card, and for a brief second, doubt flickered in his expression. But instead of acknowledging it, he scoffed. "This is fake," he said dismissively, tossing it aside. Her heart sank, not in fear, but in disappointment. Even when the truth was right in front of them, prejudice blinded them. They couldn't imagine that the woman standing before them could hold such a high rank. To admit that would mean admitting their own mistake, their own injustice, and that was something their pride would not allow. "You're lying about who you are," the taller officer said. "You think you can trick us? You think we're stupid?" Her voice dropped lower, calm but firm. I don't need to trick you. I am a general in the United States Army. You are making a very big mistake." But they laughed loud enough for the crowd to hear. "A general? Dressed like that? Driving this car? Don't make me laugh." And in that moment, the full weight of their prejudice was on display. They couldn't imagine that a black woman could be powerful, respected, or decorated. To them, generals wore medals every second of their lives, carried themselves with arrogance, and looked nothing like her. They didn't see her as a leader. They only saw their own distorted image of who belonged in power. As the minutes dragged on, the humiliation deepened. One officer made comments about her attitude, suggesting she was too confident for someone in her position. The other muttered under his breath about people like her, always thinking they could get away with anything. Every word was another cut, another reminder of the prejudice she had fought against her entire life. But inside, she was unshaken. Anger simmered, yes, but it was not the anger of helplessness. It was the anger of injustice, the kind that fuels change. She stood straighter, the handcuffs biting into her skin, but her spirit unbroken. She knew the truth of who she was, and soon, so would they. The crowd began murmuring louder now, some calling out to the officers to let her go, others questioning why she was being treated this way. But the officers ignored the voices. They were too consumed by their need to assert dominance, too blinded by prejudice to see the storm they were walking into. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this woman had the power to change their lives with a single phone call. She carried not only her own authority, but the weight of the Pentagon, the respect of the military, and the support of an entire nation behind her. And soon their arrogance would meet its reckoning. For now, though, prejudice reigned in their actions. Their mocking laughter, their disbelief, their dismissive words. All of it was on display under the flashing red and blue lights. And the general, though humiliated, remained composed, knowing that justice moves slowly. But when it arrives, it strikes with force. The night was not over. Their prejudice had written the first part of this encounter, but she would write the ending. The cuffs bit deeper into her wrists as the officers tightened them, ignoring her calm protests. The crowd watching from across the street grew larger, their murmurs turning into whispers of disbelief. Some people raised their phones higher, capturing every second, while others simply stared in shock. Here was a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, being shoved around as if she were nothing more than a petty criminal. One officer grabbed her shoulder roughly, forcing her to turn. "Walk," he ordered, pushing her toward the hood of the police car. The general stumbled slightly but quickly steadied herself. Years of discipline had taught her never to show weakness, never to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her fall. Still, the humiliation of being paraded like this in front of strangers burned deep inside her. She felt the eyes of the crowd like daggers. But what hurt more were the whispers she overheard. "Why are they arresting her? She doesn't look like a criminal. What did she even do?" Some voices carried suspicion, others sympathy, but no one knew the truth, not yet. All they saw was a black woman in handcuffs, treated as though she had no worth. The taller officer pressed her down onto the hood of the car with unnecessary force. "Spread your feet," he barked. His tone was filled with authority, but it wasn't the kind of authority that came from justice. It was the kind that came from arrogance and abuse of power. She clenched her jaw as his hand searched her roughly. Her dignity was being stripped away piece by piece in front of people who would never know the depth of her true identity. For a woman who had stood tall in war zones, who had carried the responsibility of lives and missions, this was perhaps the cruelest battlefield yet, one where her enemy was not foreign, but domestic. The other officer, meanwhile, rummaged through her car without permission. He pulled open compartments, tossed aside her belongings, and searched for evidence that didn't exist. "Nothing," he muttered after a few minutes. Still, he kept searching, unwilling to admit the truth. They had stopped her not because of what she had done, but because of who they believed she was. A young man in the crowd raised his voice. "She told you she's a general? Look at her ID. Why don't you believe her?" The officers turned sharply toward him, their faces tight with anger. "Mind your business before you get arrested too," one snapped. The crowd went quiet again, fear silencing them, but the tension hung heavy in the air. The general's mind raced. She wanted to shout, to tell everyone watching that she was not just another civilian caught in the system, but a woman who had fought for this country, bled for it, and sacrificed for it. Yet she knew that words would not matter here. Prejudice had already blinded these officers, and nothing she said would change their minds. Instead, she let her silence speak. Her posture remained straight, her eyes sharp even as the cuffs dug deeper. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. The humiliation, however, grew unbearable. The officer holding her sneered, whispering so only she could hear. "You think you're someone important? Not tonight. Tonight you're nothing." The words struck harder than the physical force. For a brief moment, a flash of anger coursed through her veins. But then, just as quickly, her training and discipline took over. She knew better than anyone that real power was not shown in anger but in control. She looked at him with calm defiance, a gaze that unsettled him more than any shouted insult could have. The minutes dragged on like hours. The flashing police lights painted the scene in red and blue, each flicker a reminder of the injustice unfolding. The crowd grew restless again, their voices rising. Some demanded the officers release her. Others questioned loudly why a woman was being treated this way. The officers, however, remained unmoved, their authority unchecked, for now. Finally, one of them pulled out a radio and muttered something to the dispatcher. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew what was happening. They were reporting her as a suspect, justifying their actions with lies and exaggerations. Her humiliation was complete. Her reputation, her honor, her dignity, all dragged through the dirt on a roadside for no reason other than prejudice. And yet, beneath it all, her spirit remained unbroken. Because while the officers thought they had control, she knew something they did not. She knew that she still had a voice, still had a way to turn this nightmare into a reckoning. And that moment would come soon. She shifted slightly, her hands straining against the cuffs. "I would like to make a call," she said firmly. The taller officer laughed mockingly. "A call? Who do you think you're going to call? Your lawyer?" She looked him directly in the eye, her voice steady as stone. "No. The Pentagon." The words hung in the air, slicing through the tension like a blade. For the first time, the officer faltered, his smirk fading ever so slightly. The crowd erupted in whispers, people gasping, some even pulling their phones closer to capture the moment. But the officer quickly masked his uncertainty with a scoff. "Pentagon, huh? You think we're stupid enough to believe that?" She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The certainty in her eyes spoke louder than any argument. She was not bluffing, and deep down the officers knew it. What they thought was a humiliating arrest was about to turn into their greatest mistake. They had wanted power, but soon they would face the full weight of the institution she represented. Their arrogance had blinded them, but the truth was about to shine, and when it did, it would destroy their careers. For now, however, the humiliation lingered. The general stood in cuffs, her body pressed against the hood of a police car. Her belongings scattered, her dignity tested. But this was not the end. It was only the turning point of a story that would echo far beyond this roadside stop. Because humiliation, when endured with strength, often transforms into power. And hers was just beginning. The cuffs pressed harder into her wrists as she straightened herself against the hood of the police car. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in her eyes, but there was no fear in them, only calm certainty. The crowd was buzzing now, restless and divided between disbelief and outrage. The officers, still puffed with arrogance, thought they had complete control. But they didn't know the truth of who they had humiliated. She drew a deep breath. Years of training had taught her that silence, when used wisely, was powerful. And now it was time to break that silence. With measured words, she said, "I want my phone. I need to make a call." The taller officer laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you're under arrest. You don't get to make demands. You're lucky we even let you speak." She fixed her eyes on him, her tone unwavering. "This is not a demand. It's a right. And when I make this call, you'll understand exactly how big a mistake you've made." Her words, steady and full of quiet authority, unsettled him. For a moment he hesitated. His pride told him she was bluffing, but something about the way she carried herself, her poise, her fearlessness made him uneasy. The shorter officer, impatient, tossed her phone onto the hood of the car with a smirk. "Fine, call whoever you think can save you. It won't change a thing." She ignored his mockery. With the cuffs still on, she shifted her hands awkwardly until she could press the screen. The crowd leaned in, the atmosphere electric, every second heavier than the last. Nobody knew who she was calling, but everyone could sense that something was about to change. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice answered. A calm, authoritative voice on the other end. "Pentagon operations, this is Colonel Davis." The crowd gasped, some covering their mouths in shock. The officers froze. Even the air itself seemed to go still. Her voice sharpened with command, the years of leadership pouring into every word. "Colonel Davis, this is General." She gave her full name and rank with absolute clarity, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "I am currently detained, handcuffed, and humiliated by 2 local officers who refuse to acknowledge my identification. I require immediate intervention." On the other end, there was a stunned silence, followed by the colonel's voice, firm and urgent. "General, are you safe? Where are you located?" She gave the exact cross streets, her tone crisp and professional, as though she were relaying coordinates on a battlefield. The crowd listened in awe, their eyes wide as the scene unfolded like something out of a movie. Colonel Davis's voice grew louder, more forceful. "Stay calm, ma'am. Do not worry. We will handle this immediately." The taller officer, suddenly pale, tried to interrupt. "Who are you really talking to? Don't play games with us." But before he could finish, the voice on speakerphone cut through the air. "This is Colonel Davis, United States Pentagon." "Who am I speaking to on scene?" The officer's face went white. The arrogance drained from him like water from a broken glass. His partner shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the crowd, who now buzzed with excitement. "This is Officer Daniels," the taller one stammered, his voice no longer firm but shaky. "Officer Daniels," Colonel Davis snapped, his tone like thunder. "You are detaining a decorated general of the United States Army. Release her immediately. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" The crowd erupted, gasps, murmurs, even a few shouts of disbelief. Phones captured every second as the once confident officers shrank under the weight of the Pentagon's voice. The general stood silently, her face calm, but her presence commanding. She didn't need to gloat or shout. Her authority spoke for itself. Colonel Davis continued, his voice sharp as steel. "This incident will be reported directly to the Pentagon leadership. Your names, your conduct, and your refusal to acknowledge a superior officer are now on record. If the general is not released within the next 30 seconds, I will personally ensure federal action is taken against your department." The taller officer fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling as he unlocked the cuffs. The moment the cold metal slipped from her wrists, she straightened, rubbing the red marks left behind. The humiliation was still fresh, but dignity rushed back into her stance. She looked every bit the leader she truly was, unbroken, unwavering. The crowd began clapping, some cheering, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The phones kept recording, flashes of light illuminating the night. The shorter officer tried to mutter an apology, but his words stumbled. We didn't know. We thought." She cut him off with a single piercing glance. "You didn't think at all. You judged." Her voice carried over the noise of the crowd, heavy with truth. "You judged me by my skin, by my gender, by my presence. Not by facts, not by evidence, and for that, you will face the consequences." Her phone was still on speaker, Colonel Davis's voice steady and supportive. "General, are you safe to leave the scene?" "Yes, Colonel," she replied, never breaking eye contact with the officers. "But ensure this is reported. Every second of this humiliation must be accounted for." "Consider it done," Davis said firmly. "Pentagon Command will be notified immediately." With that, she ended the call. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise before it. The officers stood frozen, their careers unraveling before their eyes. The crowd buzzed louder, some chanting her name now, others demanding justice. She turned slowly to face the people. Her voice, steady and strong, rose above the chaos. "This is why accountability matters. This is why prejudice must end. Tonight, you all saw what it means when authority is abused. But remember, truth always finds its way." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing down the street. And though the humiliation still burned, the fire of justice burned brighter. The officers had thought they held power. But with one phone call, the balance had shifted completely. The night that began with flashing lights and prejudice would end with their careers hanging by a thread, and her dignity restored. Because sometimes, all it takes is one call to expose the truth. And her call to the Pentagon had just changed everything. The moment her call ended, silence fell over the scene. The flashing lights of the police cars still bathed the street in red and blue. But something had shifted. The officers who had once strutted with arrogance now stood stiff, pale and visibly shaken. The general, though still feeling the sting of humiliation, stood tall with the quiet strength of someone who knew the storm she had unleashed would soon arrive. The crowd, buzzing with whispers, could sense it too. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A woman they thought was powerless, proving she was far from ordinary. Phones captured every second. Live streams shot across social media, and within minutes, the world outside that street began to notice. But the true earthquake was happening far away, inside the walls of the Pentagon. Colonel Davis's report had already reached senior officials. Phones rang. Urgent voices filled the corridors, and the incident spread like fire. This was not just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was a direct insult to one of their most respected generals, a woman who had carried the flag of the nation into battle, who had advised top leaders, who had bled for her country. To see her treated with such disrespect was not only unjust, it was intolerable. Within 30 minutes, her case was on the desk of generals whose names carried weight across the world. Emails poured into the local police department from federal authorities. Calls from Washington demanded immediate explanations. And with each passing minute, the officers' fates grew darker. Back on the roadside, the general stood surrounded by civilians who treated her like a hero. Some asked if she was okay. Others offered her water or simply words of respect. She thanked them politely but kept her focus forward. She knew the next phase had already begun. The first sign of it came when multiple unmarked black vehicles pulled up, headlights cutting through the night. Men and women in crisp suits stepped out. Federal agents, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. The crowd gasped, stepping back to make space as the agents approached with quiet precision. The lead agent, tall and commanding, walked directly to her. "General, are you safe?" he asked, his tone respectful, almost reverent. She nodded, though the red marks on her wrists told a louder story than her words. "I'm safe now." The agent turned sharply to the officers. His voice was calm, but his eyes were ice. "Officers, you will remain exactly where you are until further notice. You are under federal review." The taller officer stammered, his earlier arrogance gone. "We didn't know. She didn't show—" "Enough," the agent cut him off. "Your actions are documented. The Pentagon is fully aware. You will be escorted for questioning immediately." The crowd cheered, some even clapping as justice unfolded before their eyes. Phones filmed every second, capturing the fall of two men who had moments earlier believed they held all the power. The general remained still, watching silently. She did not smile, did not gloat. She simply stood as she always had, composed, dignified, unshaken. Meanwhile, inside the Pentagon, the response was growing larger by the minute. News outlets had already picked up the story, fueled by the viral videos spreading across the internet. Headlines blared, "Black female general humiliated by police." Pentagon intervenes after shocking arrest. Crowd captures disgraceful treatment of U.S. general. The Secretary of Defense himself was briefed before midnight. His words were sharp, his anger barely contained. "This cannot stand. A line has been crossed." Orders were given to launch a full investigation, not only into the officers but into the department itself. Every detail of their conduct, every report they had filed, every complaint against them in the past would now be unearthed. Back on the street, the officers were led into one of the unmarked vehicles. Their heads hung low, their hands shaking. The taller one tried once more to speak. "We didn't mean—" But the agent silenced him again. "You meant every action you took. Now you'll answer for them." The general finally spoke, her voice steady. "What you did tonight wasn't about the law. It was about your prejudice, and that will be remembered." Her words cut deeper than any punishment could. The crowd murmured in agreement, their respect for her growing with every second. Soon another vehicle arrived, this one for her. An aide stepped out, saluted her respectfully, and opened the door. "General, the Pentagon requests your immediate presence." She entered the car, leaving behind the flashing lights, the whispers, and the broken pride of the officers. The ride was quiet, but her mind was alive with thoughts. She had endured humiliation, yes, but now she carried the chance to turn that humiliation into justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced the same cruelty without the power to fight back. At the Pentagon, the response escalated into a storm. Statements were drafted for the press. Legal teams prepared charges. Military leaders prepared to stand by her side publicly. The incident was no longer just about two officers. It was about a system that had allowed prejudice to rule unchecked. The general entered the building to find senior officials waiting. They stood as she walked in, their respect clear in their posture. One spoke first. "General, the nation owes you an apology. What happened tonight will not be forgotten. We will make sure of it." She gave a small nod, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about me alone. This is about accountability. If prejudice can touch even someone like me, imagine how many others it crushes in silence. We must do more." Her words carried the room heavy with truth, and from that night forward, her humiliation became more than just a personal injustice. It became a rallying cry. The Pentagon's response was swift, loud, and unforgiving. The officers who had laughed at her would now face hearings, investigations, and public disgrace. Their careers, once protected by silence, were unraveling by the hour. And the general, though still bearing the sting of that night, knew that the tides of justice had turned. The Pentagon had responded not just for her, but for the principle that no one, regardless of race or gender, should ever be humiliated by those sworn to protect. The storm had begun, and it would not end until the truth was heard. The sun rose the next morning, but for the two officers it didn't bring light, it brought judgment. Overnight, the videos of their humiliation of the general had gone viral. Millions of people across the country had seen the footage. A highly respected black female general, handcuffed on the side of the road, mocked, dismissed, and shoved as if she were a criminal. Social media boiled with outrage. Hashtags trended. News anchors replayed the video again and again, their voices heavy with disbelief. What had started as a routine stop had now become a national scandal. And the two officers, once so sure of their power, now found themselves at the center of a storm they could not escape. At the local police department, chaos reigned. Phones rang nonstop. Calls from reporters, calls from activists, calls from federal agencies demanding answers. The chief of police, his face pale and sweaty, slammed his fist on his desk as another call came in from Washington. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He barked at the officers when they were brought into his office. The taller officer tried to explain, his voice shaky. "Chief, we didn't know who she was. She wasn't in uniform." "We thought," the chief cut him off, his fury exploding. "You thought? That's the problem. You didn't check, you didn't listen, you didn't even consider that you could be wrong. And now? You've embarrassed this department, this city, and the entire nation. Do you understand? You humiliated a general of the United States Army." The shorter officer lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "We were just doing our job." "Your job?" the chief thundered. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and harass. Do you realize the Pentagon is involved now? Do you realize federal agents are combing through your files as we speak? This isn't just about last night. Every ticket you wrote, every stop you made, every complaint ever filed against you, it's all under review now. You've destroyed your careers." The words hit them like bullets. The pride they had worn just hours before was gone. In its place was fear, the kind of fear that comes when the walls close in and there is nowhere left to run. Outside the station, reporters swarmed like bees, their cameras flashing, microphones in hand. "Do you have a statement? Why did you arrest her? Do you believe you'll keep your jobs?" The questions flew, but neither officer could answer. Their silence was louder than words, their shame etched clearly on their faces. Meanwhile, the Pentagon issued its own statement to the press. The Secretary of Defense himself stood before cameras, his voice sharp, his message clear. "What happened to General Ed last night was unacceptable. It was an act of prejudice and misconduct that has no place in our nation. We will not tolerate the mistreatment of those who serve, nor will we allow abuse of authority to go unpunished. The individuals involved are under full investigation. Their actions have not only harmed an honorable general, but they have also damaged the trust between law enforcement and the citizens they swore to protect." The words reverberated across the country. News outlets carried them live. Commentators dissected them. Citizens demanded justice. And slowly, the officers realized that this was not just a local scandal anymore. It was national. They were not just two men who had made a mistake. They were now the faces of prejudice, broadcast for the entire world to see. Their suspension came swiftly. Stripped of their badges and guns, they were escorted out of the department under the glare of cameras. Reporters shouted questions, citizens booed, and even some fellow officers turned away in shame. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on the general had come back to crush them. At home, their families faced the backlash too. Neighbors whispered. Friends distanced themselves. On social media, their names were cursed, their faces mocked, their actions condemned. The world that once gave them respect as officers now gave them nothing but contempt. But the worst was yet to come. Federal investigators began digging into their pasts. Old complaints resurfaced. Incidents of rude behavior, questionable stops, and accusations of racial profiling. Cases that had once been brushed aside were now front-page news. The officers who had laughed at a general now faced the reality that their entire careers were being dismantled piece by piece. The taller officer sat in his living room that night, staring blankly at the television as his own face appeared on the screen. Commentators called him arrogant, reckless, dangerous. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it hadn't been intentional, that he hadn't known who she was. But deep down he knew the truth. He hadn't needed to know her rank to treat her with dignity. He had chosen prejudice, and now prejudice had chosen his downfall. The shorter officer wasn't faring any better. His phone buzzed constantly, not with support but with messages of anger and threats. His wife wept quietly in the kitchen, asking how they would survive without his job. He had no answers. His career, his reputation, his future, it was all slipping away. Meanwhile, the general's name was being spoken across the nation with reverence. She was praised for her calm, for her strength, for her refusal to be broken. Commentators called her a symbol of dignity. Activists called her a symbol of justice. And young women, especially young black women, looked to her as proof that even in the face of humiliation, courage and truth could win. The officers watched this unfold from the shadows of their ruined lives. They saw her face on television, heard her voice in interviews where she spoke not with bitterness but with wisdom. "This isn't just about me," she said calmly to one reporter. "It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly because of prejudice. It's about ensuring that those who hold power are held accountable. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, and that is why we must not stay silent." Her words cut deeper than any punishment could, because in them was the final truth. Their actions had not only destroyed their own careers, but had also built her legacy even stronger. She had turned their attempt to humiliate her into a moment of national reckoning. The officers, once proud, now sat in silence, realizing the full weight of what they had done. Their uniforms no longer gave them respect. Their badges no longer gave them power. And their careers, once the foundation of their lives, lay in ruins. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on her had become their own destruction. And the world watched as their downfall became a warning to anyone who believed prejudice could go unpunished. The scandal had shaken the nation. What began as a humiliating traffic stop on a quiet city street had grown into a movement, a moment of truth that no one could ignore. The image of a black female general, handcuffed and mocked, had burned itself into the public conscience. But what mattered most was not how she had been humiliated. It was how she had risen from that humiliation with dignity, and how her strength turned a night of injustice into a beacon of change. The officers' careers were already finished. Their badges, once symbols of authority, now lay in evidence lockers stripped of honor. Their names had become synonymous with prejudice. Their downfall a lesson for every law enforcement officer who thought power gave them the right to judge unjustly. But while their ruin made headlines, it was the general's resilience that made history. In the weeks that followed, she spoke not with anger but with purpose. She gave interviews on national television, her calm voice echoing across millions of homes. "What happened to me," she explained, "is not unique. The only difference is that I had the rank and authority to call the Pentagon. Many do not. Many suffer in silence. That must change." Her words resonated. Protests erupted in cities across the country. Not just for her, but for all the unnamed men and women who had been treated unfairly by those sworn to protect them. Signs were lifted high. Justice for all. End prejudice now. Respect every citizen. And at the heart of these movements, her story was told again and again, not as a tale of victimhood, but as one of strength and accountability. The Pentagon, too, took action. Reforms were announced. Training programs on racial bias and accountability were expanded nationwide. New policies demanded greater oversight of local departments. Federal investigators were dispatched to review complaints that had long been ignored. The general's ordeal became the spark that forced leaders to admit that change could no longer be delayed. At a special ceremony weeks later, she stood in uniform once again, her stars shining proudly on her shoulders. This time, however, the cameras that surrounded her were not capturing her humiliation but her triumph. The Secretary of Defense himself stood beside her, addressing the crowd. Tonight we honor not just a general but a symbol of truth and justice. She endured what no one should endure, and she turned it into a lesson that will guide us forward. Her courage has reminded us that prejudice cannot coexist with service, and that accountability is not optional. It is required. The applause thundered, filling the hall. Soldiers, officials, citizens all stood in respect. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the strength of a woman who had faced injustice yet stood taller than ever. But what touched her most were the letters that poured in from ordinary people. A young black girl wrote, "I want to be like you one day. You showed me that I can wear the uniform too." A veteran wrote, "Thank you for reminding me why I served, that justice is worth fighting for." Even parents wrote, thanking her for being a role model their children could look up to. She read each letter carefully, humbled by the impact her story had made. For her, this was never about fame or recognition. It was about dignity, about showing that no one, not even a general, was immune to prejudice and that silence was never the answer. Yet privately, she carried the memory of that night like a scar. She remembered the cold bite of the handcuffs, the mocking laughter of the officers, the sting of being doubted even with her ID in plain sight. These memories hurt, but they also strengthened her resolve. She promised herself that she would use her position to ensure fewer people experienced that same pain. Months later, she was invited to speak at a national conference on justice and equality. Leaders from across the country sat in the audience along with activists, students, and law enforcement officers. She stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet gentle, and began to speak. "What happened to me was humiliating," she admitted. "But humiliation does not define us. How we respond does. I could have stayed silent. I could have let anger consume me. But instead I chose to act. And tonight I ask you all to do the same. When you see prejudice, challenge it. When you see abuse of power, expose it. And when you see injustice, fight it. Not with hate, but with truth." The hall erupted in applause. Some stood to clap. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Her words had cut deep, not because they were angry, but because they were true. Her legacy grew from that day onward. She became not just a general, but a symbol. Schools taught her story as an example of courage. Communities invited her to speak about leadership and dignity. Her face appeared not just on news channels, but in history books, alongside those who had stood against injustice and made a difference. And while the officers faded into obscurity, remembered only for their shame, she remained in the public eye as a reminder of what true strength looks like. Her story was no longer about humiliation. It was about triumph. It was about turning the ugliest moment into the most powerful. Years later, when she retired from service, the Pentagon held a ceremony in her honor. Soldiers lined the hall, saluting as she walked through. Young recruits looked at her with admiration, inspired by her journey. She had lived her dream not only as a soldier, but as a leader who reshaped the meaning of justice. In her final address as a general, she said, "Titles fade. Uniforms come off. But what remains is the legacy we leave behind. Mine is not a story of power. It is a story of dignity, and I hope it reminds every person, young or old, that no one has the right to strip you of your worth. Stand tall even in the darkest night, because the truth always shines." The hall erupted in cheers, her words echoing like a vow. And so, her story became a lasting reminder. The night she was handcuffed could have been the night her dignity was stolen. Instead, it became the night her strength was revealed to the world. The officers lost their careers, but she gained something greater, an unshakable legacy. Her name was written not only in military history, but in the history of justice itself. She was no longer just the general who was arrested. She was the general who turned humiliation into hope, prejudice into reform, and injustice into a legacy that would inspire generations. And that legacy, bright and unyielding, would live forever.